Hello again, everybody. Thank you so much for being here with us today. My name is Stephanie Waller, pronouns she, her, and I am the program director at Grantmakers for Education. On behalf of our entire team, I'd like to welcome you to From Connections to Power to Liberation, Imperatives for Education Justice. I also want to thank our co-hosts, Communities for Just Schools Fund. We are joined today by a phenomenal lineup of speakers representing both CJSF and their movement partners for a powerful conversation that could not be more timely. All of us in the fight for education justice and true systems transformation know that this work requires bold and sustained action over time, particularly in the face of coordinated and organized attacks. With the From Connections to Power to Liberation report, CJSF and their movement partners provide a model for what the path forward looks like when philanthropy embraces radical listening as a means to support and advance justice. During today's program, which is running 90 minutes, you'll learn more about CJSF's work, hear from experts about the policy and social context in which we're operating, review findings from the report, and most importantly, hear directly from CJSF and their movement partners. We recognize that our audience today comes from foundations of varying sizes and structures, as well as a range of lived experiences related to education justice. And we want to hear from you today. We invite you to really deeply engage throughout today's program in the chat and via some questions that we'll pose via a Zoom poll. And to get us started, I don't want to delay us any further. I'm happy to turn things over now to Manuela Arciniegas, the dynamic executive director at Communities for Just Schools Fund, who will take us through the rest of today's program. Manuela, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, GFE family. My name is Manuela Arciniegas, and my pronouns are she, her. I'm the executive director of the Communities for Just Schools Fund. I'm an Afro-Dominican mother of 4 children who have been educated in New York's public schools. I am zooming in from the sacred land of the Lenape people in Goshen, New York, and I would love to hear a little bit from you. My icebreaker question to this community is, who do you do this work for? And so kindly turn to your chat and reflect. Who do you do this work for? CJSF and GFE proudly welcome all of you, irrespective of where you are on your donor member learning journey. I'm going to invite my colleague Nico to share our slides in the screen as I tell you a little bit about CJSF. And so CJSF, we are a national collaborative of community organizers and funders working to advance education justice in schools and communities. Our mission is to resource the power of the young global majority, their caregivers and educators, as they build liberatory education that centers safety, dignity, justice, and wellness. We envision a world where Black, Brown, Indigenous, trans, queer, immigrant, neuro-expansive, and disabled people are holistically safe. And they experience schools that are communities full of care, full of affirmation and belonging. And so I would love to show you a little bit about what we're going to be doing today. As Nico quickly flashed through that screen, we're going to be talking with our movement partners about how they define the conditions and context where they're currently working, as well as hear from them about what they're seeing on the ground and share their recommendations of our strategic imperatives report. And so what CJSF does is slide 5, we provide general operating grants, technical assistance and capacity strengthening, convening and network building, and federal strategy support to our network of 78 local, state, and national grassroots organizing groups and networks. They are situated across 22 states and territories, including the Canada and Puerto Rico. And since 2017, we have deployed over $31 million to the grassroots organizing field. Collectively, our partners represent bases of over 1 million people across the country. Next slide. And so currently, public education systems foreground exclusion, underinvestment, and racism. Some funders on this call that we've spoken to have shared that funders in schools both are facing DEI fatigue And some of the folks, our colleagues in the field, are actually backing away from philanthropic investments centering justice. Change work is complex and takes place at the intersection of various overlapping public systems. And so when we're thinking about our young people, their caregivers, our educators, the communities where they're situated, and they're actually working at the intersection of the criminal legal system, the immigration system, the environmental system, climate, economy. Base building organizations that you see reflected on this map are often the first responders when public systems fail marginalized communities. So through a variety of change strategies, our partners have successfully changed the way schools deliver K through 12 education, social emotional learning, out of school time learning, youth development supports. Our partners have also successfully moved millions of dollars from public school budgets away from punitive approaches to holistic supports and affirming supports for young people and their families. And so, despite being an example of real democracy in action, the community organizing field is grossly underfunded. Organizing and people of color led organizations receive, on average, single-digit percentage investments compared to other education philanthropic giving. And so we invite our colleagues to reflect. Philanthropy must support community leaders to raise their voice and build more people and governing power. The power that they build is to stave off school closures, underinvestment, over-policing, the physical assaults of young people in schools, anti-critical race theory moves, and broad gender and cultural and racial discrimination. Our network has shown the power of Black, Brown, migrant, and queer-led organizing. Next slide. A recent Stanford Social Innovation Review article by Mark Kramer and Steve Phillips entitled "Strategic Philanthropy Has Failed. What is Next?" That article calls on philanthropy to prioritize people over programs, partnerships, not patronage, and proximity, not prescriptive change. And so we dropped the article in the chat for your review. In the Strategic Imperatives report that we're sharing today, our partners have presented a clear mandate for philanthropy, and it is to listen deeply and respond in line with a long-term commitment to organizing. We invite all of you on this call to reflect with us. What will you do to support community leaders as they catalyze long-term systems change and advance justice? How will you support them? And so we would love to turn to Jesse to take us through a quick poll and bring your voices in the room. We're all impacted by the changing conditions in our society, and we'd like to know how you and your institution and grantees have been impacted. And so we have two questions. The first is, what does your foundation fund? And please feel free to click on all of the topics, the themes, and the strategies that you all support. Oh, look at these findings. Let's take a peek. So yes, 46% of you are resourcing youth organizing. Wonderful. 54% in policy and advocacy. It's about an even split between most of these strategies. A large percentage of you are interested in K through 12 education and youth and families. This is wonderful news. And so let's move to the next question, which is, on a scale of 1 to 5, how impacted are your movement partners or your grantees by forces of rising fascism or authoritarianism as a force obstructing education justice? So if you are all seeing and concerned about what's happening in the world and in our country in particular, and fascism and authoritarianism, have you heard from your colleagues, from your higher ups in philanthropy, from your partners that you're supporting? Have they also reported being impacted by these forces? So let us know if one, not at all, people are not talking about it like it's a thing, or if they're 5, extremely heavily impacted. And then once those findings come out, we will talk about them a little bit. Yeah, right. So we also concur with these findings. 50% of your partners and your institutions are reporting being heavily impacted by rising fascism and authoritarianism. None of you are living in a bubble and in another country or in another planet saying that you are not impacted. We are all clear that this is affecting all of us, and most importantly, affecting the least resource and supported communities. And so today, CJSF is really proud to present the launch of our milestone report, From Connections to Power to Liberation. And we welcome our first speaker, Scott Nakagawa from the 22nd Century Initiative. Scott's team has spent a lot of time mapping the ways, and you can feel free to jump to the next slide, Nico, mapping the ways in which right-wing authoritarian forces and fascism currently impact American public life. Scott's going to contextualize a little bit something about these forces and the conditions that our partners are currently navigating. So Scott, take it away.
All right, thank you, Manuela. And I'm just going to talk for about 5 minutes here to help us put things in context. I noticed on the poll that you just took around how you're being affected by rising authoritarianism and fascism, that 100% of you are at least somewhat impacted, and 50% of you describe yourself as heavily impacted. So this kind of contextualization may be helpful in understanding just why that's happening. So, the news around the world is not great. In 2010, 49.6% of the world's people lived under autocratic governments, just under half. Today, though, at least until 2023, 71% of the world's people lived under such governments. This changed as a result of a year-over-year percentage gain for autocracy that is continuing. There are some challenges to this progress of autocracy. Places like Poland and Brazil, for example, have been challenging their autocratic leaders, but the general trend continues, and the United States is included in it. Liberal democracies now only hold a minority of the world's people, and the trend globally is that countries are growing more autocratic. Those countries that are growing more autocratic tend to be larger, while those that are growing more democratic are smaller. That's why when I talk about this, I use the percentage of the world's people. So places like the Seychelles, for example, are growing more democratic, whereas NATO members like Hungary, for example, are growing more autocratic. That means that in the world, we have far less leverage than we have in past generations, particularly those of us who are building social movements for equity and justice. And that impact that we're experiencing here in the United States is mirrored in places all over the world. So as I said, among the countries growing more autocratic is the United States. This slowed down some since 2020, but is expected to continue. The 2016 election really caused the biggest spike in Democratic backsliding in the United States, and the 4 years that followed continued that trend. And we are likely to see that get even worse, particularly with situations on our hands like climate disasters, which are invitations to authoritarians to grab power. So there are many drivers of the crisis of democracy we're in around the world, and many means by which autocrats are taking over. But what they have in common, all of them, is very clear. We are at a time of rapid change, technological, cultural, economic, social, and environmental. In this time, people are growing more and more anxious. They are starting to see that governments are not capable of dealing with some of the challenges we are facing as they're currently configured, and losing faith in that as a possibility, and are trying to challenge governments in a way that is basically coming from all sides, right? So it brings to mind the Yeats poem, the center will not hold. That seems to be the situation we have, all sides attacking the middle simultaneously. Fear is the tip of the wedge. So inciting fear and turning that into rage is a particular tactic of theirs. They have been waging culture wars in order to accomplish this. And among the key institutions where those wars are being waged is our schools. I think all of us here on the call know that advocating for supporting our public schools is a duty of each of us as residents of this country. And that it is a very important duty because schools are not just where people learn how to do math and to read, et cetera, all of which are, of course, very important. They're also sites of socialization where people learn what it means to live together justly, in equity and harmony. And, so as schools become more and more sites of conflict and fear and frustration and anger and demonization, that translates through society in a way that will have a powerful impact. Now, the key ways in which they are driving rage are race. That is the common factor across the various factions of the right, is that they hold in common racist views, but also patriarchy. And that's really important to us if we're concerned about our schools, right? Patriarchy is articulated in growing misogyny, which is happening all around us. The rates of violence being directed against women, the number of threats, political threats that are being lodged against women leaders is growing very rapidly. But it also is about the shape of our families and about the status of children. The right has been very effective as using children and fear of what can happen to children, predation of their vulnerability, in order to get their base into motion. All of this, though, I think important to keep in mind, is happening while we are actively participating. So the right is not pulling off any of what they are accomplishing on their own. They're actually provoking us to react. International expert on democracy and autocracy once told me that when the dominant ethnic group in a multi-ethnic society goes in an ultra-nationalist direction, as the white nationalists are in the United States, those countries frequently fail. But they don't just fail because right-wingers are deciding to attack our government. They fail because the rest of us react to these circumstances by growing more particularistic. That's the general trend, to move away from universal ideas toward more particularistic ones, to become more tribalistic, to become more specifically interested in the safety and well-being of ourselves and those immediately around us. This causes us to opt out of debates over the future of institutions like our schools or the meaning of nationality, and leaves those arenas of kind of ideological contestation to those on the right. So that's basically the situation we're in. The United States is growing increasingly autocratic. It is no longer considered a consolidated democracy, which is one of the measures people use. The basis for multiracial democracy no longer exists within our government as it's currently configured. And so all of those things need to be taken into consideration. That doesn't mean that these can't be corrected, but in order for them to be corrected, we're going to have to address some of the key issues where it's possible for us to cobble together supermajorities. And so again, I want to say it's so important that we're focusing on the schools here, because schools, in spite of all of the attacks, remain extremely popular as not just places of learning, but as community institutions. So they're one of the ways in which we might be able to start to cobble together the kind of coalition that can change these conditions, such that when you're polled again, 50% of you won't say you're heavily impacted. Perhaps 50% of you would say you were inspired to take an action and then things got better. So thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Scott. And with that grounding around the current conditions, I want to introduce you to Dimitri Holzman, a fellow at Race Forward and the founder and leader of Earthseed International. Dimitri is also the co-facilitator of the process alongside Casey Foster that generated the wisdom in our report. And this is the report that we're presenting and launching for you all today so that you can strengthen your philanthropic practices. So feel free, Dimitri, to jump in.
Great. Thanks very much, Manuela, and also to Scott for setting a really important and somewhat scary context for us, but perhaps, as you were saying, scary in a way that helps us kind of sharpen our focus. So yeah, good afternoon, everybody. As Manuela said, I was one of the co-facilitators of the process, which culminated in the launching today of this report titled From Connections to Power to Liberation. I'm also a longstanding partner within the CJSF network. And my job today actually is to just introduce at a very high level the findings that are contained in the report. So I want to just encourage folks to obviously not take this as the whole thing, but to go and read the report. But also just want to state that while I'll be giving some of the high-level context and speak to some of the findings, immediately after my presentation, Casey, as well as a number of the partners in the CJSF network, will actually speak to some of those aspects in a little bit more detail. So if we can go to the next slide, please. I want to just say, first off, before we go into each of these aspects of the what we've called the 5 strategic imperatives for education justice in this report, to give you a little background and context as to how we came to these findings. So this process was actually initiated in September at a in-person convening, which gathered all of the partners in the CJSF network for 3 days in Baltimore. And at that convening, Casey and myself facilitated a number of sessions with the partners, in essence, to try and identify, one, what were some of the common and most important challenges that were being faced by CJSF partners in doing their work to advance education justice. So one was identifying what were some of the challenges, and these were not, let me say the challenges, and then connected to that, also to try and identify which were the most important, which were the ones that are affecting everybody the most, so that we could identify what additional capacities and additional support to the field could be provided in order to address those challenges. And the reason that we're talking about them as strategic imperatives, because the idea was not that we would identify what additional resources or capacity could be added as kind of nice to haves, but rather that if we did not address these challenges, if we did not provide additional support to these imperatives, that we would not in fact be advancing education justice as a vision. So we did that convening. We identified these 5 strategic imperatives, namely base building, political education, strategic alignment, healing justice, and narrative power, which we then used, Casey and myself, as the basis to then discuss both through one-on-one interviews with CJSF partners and through a number of partner assemblies in which we again gathered big groups of the CJSF partners to discuss some of these challenges and then the solutions to them. So that's really the basis and background to this report. If we can move to the next slide, please. As I said, we are going to go into these in a lot more detail during Casey's session, but I'm going to speak just to these top lines. So one, I want to say the first three of these strategic imperatives can really be understood as the kind of core and basis of all organizing and power building work. Most of the organizations in CJSF's network are doing some kind of base building. And also a number of the partners identified that base building had become a challenge, both through the pandemic, but for a number of partners, this had also been a challenge even before the COVID-19 pandemic. In essence, what partners were saying was that despite their best efforts, in many instances, bases were either not growing or in some instances were shrinking. I do also want to say, and this applies to both base building, to political education, and to the third strategic imperative around shared vision, that while there were significant challenges in the field, through this process, we also identified that there were a number of shining examples where, despite the broader conditions that made it difficult for a number of, or created challenges for a number of partners, that there were also examples of partners in the network overcoming those challenges, and in fact, in some instances, growing their bases during these instances, during this period. So, as the slide says, this process then, with the partners, identified that what the field needs is more staffing capacity, more organizational infrastructure. A number of partners complained about being stuck in a cycle of needing to respond to day-to-day conditions, or really having a short-term approach and not being able to step out of responding to those immediate conditions and thinking about more long-term strategy. In essence, what they were talking about is a need to return to the basics of base building. Again, I've mentioned that there are a number of examples in the field that partners identified to say, we don't just want to, theoretically talk about how to improve base building. Can we be supported to go and connect with another CJSF partner who is doing well, to see how they're doing it, and to, in essence, learn from each other. The last thing I'll mention about this is that, mutual aid was in fact one of the things that came up during a number of the interviews, that, organizations that had already had mutual aid as a core part of their organizing model, or those that pivoted to adopt more mutual aid strategies, were some of the ones that did better during the conditions of the pandemic. Anyway, it was an important thing for us to highlight in this process. If we can go to the next slide, please. I want to also then say, so political education was the second, again, another core part of organizing and building power. Here, the partners identified that there were questions, at least, around whether or not existing political education programs were effective or reaching enough people. Again, similarly, as I said before, some partners found this to be challenging, while there were, again, a few examples within the network where there were successful political education programs. And so, again, one of the main recommendations that came out of this process was to support more cross-learning efforts across the CJSF network. In essence, what we're saying is that, and we can move to the next slide, that for these first three strategic imperatives, that the call is not actually, it's not an ask to reinvent the wheel. It's in fact an ask to support capacity and space to be able to go back to the basics. And again, that applies for this question of strategic alignment. So the third strategic imperative came out of an identified challenge that, although there are a number of organizations doing education justice work, including some national networks and coalitions that are looking to combine and connect different capacities within the field, that there seemed to be a gap in a shared vision for what the education justice movement should be. So just to, one of the examples was a deep conversation about how it is that many organizations might not even agree very easily on what education justice means. For example, like, what is that shared vision? And so the strategic alignment imperative speaks really to a need, and some of this work has already begun, but for a need for organizations to be able to come together to actually build what that shared vision is. And we want to just be clear on this. We're not talking about creating a new alliance, a new coalition. Those already exist, but can we actually bring some of those together to build, again, a clear and shared vision for the future of education justice work? We can move to the next slide, please. It feels like I'm going fast. It's because I am trying to rush through a lot of information here. There's just two slides left here. One, and I'm going to go through the healing justice and narrative power pretty quickly. These so again, there was an identified need for deeper healing justice practices to exist and be supported both inside organizations and in the way in which they look to the external world. And really, this is just stemming from the fact that the impacts of COVID, we would even argue that the impacts of the previous administration and the both health and economic circumstances have made some of the work as organizers, and for the people that those organizers are organizing, has made the conditions really difficult. That a lot of organizations, even for their internal infrastructure, are needing to develop deeper healing justice practices so that we can avoid the high levels of burnout and staff turnover that we've seen under this most recent period. If we can move also to the next slide, please, Nico. Okay, so then the final strategic imperative, and I think we would argue, is the one to which the solution feels slightly less clear than the previous imperatives, although the challenge feels very clear, is that a number of the partners named that, they're working in conditions where building narrative power is an uphill battle. The right-wing forces, connected to what Scott was saying, are really powerful, thinking about the way in which narratives around austerity, neoliberalism, are are the narratives against which a number of our partners are needing to fight against, and many of them do not have the capacity and in some instances the necessary expertise to do so. If I can move then to the last two slides, I'm going to skip that last part on this one. Just to summarize then the key recommendations that came out in this report under each of the imperatives. One, for base building, being that the partners are asking for deeper and longer term investments, both for convening and training new leaders, as well as sharing emergent innovations. Two, that under political education, the partners have asked for investing in organizations to be able to deepen and assess how their political education programs need to be deepened or expanded to respond to today's conditions. Thirdly, under strategic alignment, that there's a call to create dedicated funding for intentional collaborations, particularly at the regional and state level, thinking about state coalitions and networks. Okay, yeah, if we can move to the next slide, please. The last two imperatives, here the request is that there are dedicated resources for partners to build and wield their narrative and cultural power, including support for dedicated communications personnel and or staff, as well as additional capacity to partner with artists and other communicators, as well as other experts in building narrative and cultural power. And then lastly, to healing justice, that the main call there is to increase investments and support to organizations to be able to help them embed healing justice frameworks and approaches, from internal organizational development to the external campaign strategy and demands. So there's a lot to cover there, and I know that I went through this fast, but the purpose really was to set the framework for Casey and the partners to talk to some of these aspects in a little bit more detail. So Casey, I'm going to hand over to you. As I mentioned before, Casey is my co-facilitator in this process and also the director of Partners for Dignity and Rights. Casey, I'll hand over to you.
Awesome. And good afternoon, everyone. I'll use Dimitri's intro as my introduction, so I will not waste time on an introduction. I just maybe to give people a sense of the conversation that we're going to be having now is, thinking of Manuela's comments and Scott's framework and the imperatives that Dimitri shared with us. I think for me, it is about when we are talking about a multiracial democracy, how is a democracy undergirded by values of equity and inclusion, and how do we actually get there? And I think the way we get there, I know the way we get there is that we're going to be led by people to get there. And we can be led by people that are grounded in organizations that share those values. And so we have an amazing lineup of folks who are working with those most impacted by the conditions that Scott laid out for us at the top of the call. So we're going to jump right into the conversation and bringing their work and their voices into the conversation for everyone. So I'm going to start with Lady, and I'm going to ask Lady to introduce yourself, your organization, and provide us with a snapshot of what your organization's work is.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lady Robledo. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm one of the co-directors of the Alliance for Educational Justice. We are a movement building alliance of youth organizing groups who fight for educational justice. Most of our organizations do youth organizing. Some of them do intergenerational organizing around education. AJ was founded because there was a need for a national strategy to uplift local fights. In the process of coming together and starting to learn a little bit more about different campaigns, our founding members realized that we needed to build this alliance that went beyond just one campaign, but to build this broader vision. I think one of the pieces that really united everybody is that you know, that educations are sites where we have seen historic fights transform society. We really believe schools are microcosms of society. And when we're able to make something happen and the world sees that it's possible, it can change. It could change things all over the country. And so that's why we just, you know, we decided to found AEJ. Part of our work has been, you know, to make space for organizations to analyze the work that a space for reflection, a place where you can learn about campaigns, build relationships, and actually build trust to do real, authentic solidarity action, to do real intersectional work, and then be able to lift the power of the local folks that are, you know, the work that folks are doing on the ground.
Thank you for that, lady. And I want to ask, as related to the strategic imperatives, that you could shine some light on, you know, what can you talk a little bit to narrative power and political education and the importance of building narrative power, sustaining narrative power, and political education for Alliance for Educational Justice?
Yeah, so one of the work that we've spearheaded is the police free schools work. So part of the work that AEJ did was a couple years ago, maybe like 2017, our organizations had been working on school to prison pipeline. And then we started tracking the assaults that were happening by school officers in schools. And we started calling out the state-sanctioned violence, right, that's happening in these publicly funded schools. As we began doing that, right, again, right, convening folks together, we started to develop this political analysis because we knew that because it's state-sanctioned violence, like nobody was calling it out as that, right? And nobody was actually tracking this kind of work. There was no data around it, right? In order to understand what was really happening, because there was a pattern that was happening over and over again, we had to develop political education curriculum that really, you know, we've been doing school to prison pipeline work, but that really focused in this other character, right, police, in order to be, and so we started digging deeper and deeper and deeper, building our abolitionist political analysis within schools, right? We're very clear that our fight for police-free schools is not just about removing police, but it's about adding everything that schools need, right? To be a place of transformation, a place where young people are able to explore who they want to be, how can they be part of this community, and that they continue to practice this these ideas of self-governance and self-determination.
Thank you for that, lady. And I think, you know, a lot of the folks who are probably joining us, you've seen the way that the narrative around policing in schools has changed over the years, particularly since Alliance for Educational Justice and many of their partners have been doing their work. So once again, lady, thank you for sharing. And I want to, my panelist people, I actually am going to have a little bit of I'm going to take a facilitator's privilege here and bring Joseph's voice into the conversation, because I think some of the work that Joseph and Students Deserve in LA really speaks to what Lady was sharing with us. So Joseph, if you could just start by introducing yourself, your organization, and again, just a snapshot of your organization's work.
Yeah. All right. We juggling. We throwing me off. All right. All right, Casey. What's up, family? Joseph Williams. I am the director of Students Deserve. We are in Los Angeles. We are a youth-led but intergenerational grassroots organization working to make Black Lives Matter in schools. And building off of what Lady said, you know, some of our work is around ending the school to prison pipeline, fighting for police-free schools. But other parts of our work are also about what we really need in schools, right? Like Lady said, abolition and police-free schools isn't just about removing cops from schools. It's also thinking about what kinds of resources and supports and programs do young people need in schools. So we work on a number of things on the divest side, working to end policies and practices that criminalize young people. We've worked to end daily random searches in LAUSD, the use of pepper spray against students. We've divested $25 million annually from the LA School Police Department. And we've also worked on the invest side. We work really deeply with community schools and support young people to sit on the community school steering committee. We work with Black student achievement and have fought for the creation and expansion of the BSAP plan, the Black Student Achievement Plan in LAUSD, to be now over 120 million annual investment in a host of resources supporting Black student achievement. So we work on a lot of those different pieces. Again, trying to make schools a place that holistically center and support and love on young people.
And I think you went right. You named a number of really, I think, inspiring victories that you all have been involved in the past couple of years, including redirecting public funding from policing in schools to an achievement program and plan for Black students in LA schools. Can you speak to, these imperatives? And we have this base building as an imperative. Can you speak to how important it's been for you all to center young people's leadership in the work and diverting funds from policing and moving funds towards what they need, which includes community schools and other holistic programs? Can you speak to the importance of having young people that you're recruiting into the organization that's leading the work?
Absolutely. And that really is the lifeblood of our work, right? Youth, not only youth leadership and youth advocacy, but youth organizing, right? Young people organizing other young people, identifying, recruiting, activating, developing the leadership of other young people to be their spokespeople, their advocates in this moment. And that has been extremely important. In fact, all of the victories that I just named don't happen without young people, number one, being in the lead publicly, their voices, their experiences being centered, right? Being heard, being valued, and being acted on. Too often, for Black folks, we often say nothing about us without us. But that does not often extend to young people, right? Especially in a society that is run by adults and school systems that are run by adults. Young people's voices are often not included in way, or it's in really tokenizing ways, or in, you don't have real leadership or say. And so we try to create an organization that really is responsive to and led by young people, and where young people can lead on as many of the different conversations and decision-making pieces as possible. And that's also a really key strategy for our base building, is that supporting young people to get involved in something also means making it a space that young people feel ownership over and that young people can help to shape. And so it's been extremely important for young people to say, this is my organization and this is my movement, and we're working on things that are directly impacting me in the classroom every day. And I want to talk to my friends, my classmates, my teachers, my parents, right? Again, as an intergenerational movement, it's not just young people to young people. It's also young people speaking to adults, speaking truth to power, and also bringing adult advocates and allies into the movement alongside them. So base building is absolutely the lifeblood of our organizing. And again, if we're thinking about the broader context that Scott and other folks have laid out, it's also so important for not just our local victories, but how are we fighting for educational justice and fighting against these forces of authoritarianism and autocracy and all these other things.
Appreciate it, Joseph. And if we have time, Joseph and Lady, I'm going to bring your voices back into the conversation for sure. But I think this is actually a really good transition to Zakia, who I know personally as a parent organizer, who got her start organizing parents in New York City. And so, Zakia, I would like to give you the opportunity to share introduce yourself to everyone who's joined us today, your organization, and a snapshot of your work.
Yeah. Hi all. Assalamu alaikum to my Muslim brothers and sisters. Eid Mubarak. Zakia here. I am the co-executive director of the Alliance for Quality Education. I'm a Black Muslim woman, a mom of 8, a grandmother of 4, I have been doing educational justice work for almost 25 years. The Alliance for Quality Education is a leading statewide advocacy group here in New York. We've been fighting for the equitable funding of our public schools for next year will be 25 years too. We are most known for our fight for the campaign for fiscal equity. As you talk about strategic alignment that was brought up, we have it is because of strategic alignment of collaboration between labor, community, parents, students, educators for the last 25 years that got us to a point where we were actually able to get the campaign for fiscal equity fulfilled, which was an equity lawsuit, which so many of us, I'm sure, have around our states now, but almost 30 years ago, which stated that New York State wasn't meeting its constitutional obligation to provide a child with a sound basic education. And while that's how we started, obviously it doesn't stay there because we're not just asking for money for the sake of money. We also in the business of ending the school to prison pipeline, culturally responsive and sustaining education, pre-K, early childhood education. You know why? Because it's a continuum. It doesn't just start in K to 12 and it doesn't end there either.
Thank you. Can you, I guess one thing I want to pull into this, what we're hearing from all three of you, there are different forces. Scott's talked about the forces that are pushing on the system, right? And in many ways, forces that are trying to hollow out public education as one of the last public goods that we have, right? And Lady and Joseph and Zakiya are talking about the forces that they are building up among those that are most impacted by the conditions that are harming people in schools, right? Particularly folks that are in exploited neighborhoods, folks that are coming from communities that are always having to kind of deal with oppression from outside forces. And there needs to be multiple stakeholders that are brought to the table to build that kind of power through strategic alignment. And so, Zakiya, you mentioned labor and parents. Can you talk a little bit about, how important it's been for your work, particularly in winning and securing, the funds that you have for New York City public school students? How important has strategically aligning those different stakeholders been for your work?
Yeah, I just also say that when I started in my organization, I was a parent volunteer. And so I've been working for AQB for 16 years, but before my thing was just like so many other parents getting involved in volunteering. The collaboration is, it's often not easy to bring everybody together, right? Because parents and young people are, as it was shared, are not often seen as an equal. But once people get past that and you're able to like get in that space, we have been able to really do amazing things. Again, the reason it took from 1993 all the way to 2023 to finally get the state to commit to fully funding almost $6 billion to public schools in New York State was because we were able to continue and keep that strategic alignment, that collaboration of parents and educators and young people and community members and anybody who cared about education at the forefront and charging and actually holding our legislature accountable because they had not fulfilled this commitment. And who else could identify what was actually still not in our schools than those very people, right? The educators who are in the classroom, the parents who are taking their kids to school, and every year they get to the next level grade and what they had before is no longer there. And community members, right, who could talk about all those things. And so those collaborations were important and vital because it showed that there was an alignment to the legislature who would try as many times to silo us. And we know when we're siloed, we tend to get picked off. And so those collaborations are vital and important, and we've been able to keep them. And they, let's be clear, like sometimes you start one way and you're all in alignment, and sometimes you divert, right? And sometimes labor is not all in on with you. And sometimes, there's different things that move you in a different way. But because we were able to create this alignment and collaboration, we were able to get to a finish line in 2023 where finally, again, it shouldn't take 30 years. Let's be clear, should never take 30 years to get a fulfillment of something that should have been, 30 years ago. But we got there, right? And I think the more we do that, it builds up a narrative that we don't have to take 30 more years to get there. Now we're all in, we're in alignment, and we've seen what we've been able to do. And that gives us a level of hope too, like, in a system, in a world, in a narrative that feels hopeless.
I think one thing that's sitting with Zakiya, you said, shouldn't take 30 years. And I think a lot of people will probably acknowledge on this call that one of the threats to public education is our vouchers, right? Whether or not states are calling them vouchers or entrepreneurial credits or tax credits or education spending accounts. And I think the thing for me in terms of why these imperatives that we're talking about are about long-term investments in organizations. And it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. I mean, if we look at vouchers now and the expansion of vouchers, I think at least 12 new states in 2023 were able to expand the use of vouchers. As we look at Brown versus the Board of Education, Prince George County, where that was first filed, one of the responses that white parents had then was to create a different system in which that the public funds would go to send white kids to privately segregated schools, right? And so there's a marathon there that they've been running that I think is threatening public education as a good that everyone will be able to access in the next 10 or 15 years. And that we don't catch up to a marathon in one sprint. We have to sprint at times, but we have to also sustain ourselves so that we're running the marathon. And that's why I want to bring in Mercedes' voice, who's been working with educators and would love for us to kind of hear from Mercedes on this point about sustaining. Mercedes, thank you for joining us. So would love for you to introduce yourself, share a snapshot of your organization and your work, and maybe speak to how you all are building space for educators to sustain themselves and be able to be in a marathon to save public education in Puerto Rico, but also be a marker and inspiration for the rest of us.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity, Grant Makers for Education and Community for Just Schools. I am Mercedes Martinez. I am the president of the Federación de Maestros y Maestras de Puerto Rico, Teachers Federation of Puerto Rico. Is a union that was founded in 1966, so we have been here for a while. In our country, during the past decades, the public education system has been on the eyes of the private sector that has been seeking another way to make profit on our schools budget, like the United States. Decades of neglect and misgovernment has led part of the neoliberal agenda in our country in the Department of Education that has implied hundreds of school closures. We're talking that from 2014 till 2018, our country shut down 567 schools. And many of the schools that were shut down were used by the government or sold by the government to for-profit private schools, and others were abandoned for the communities. They planned to shut down over 800 schools. We were able to save more than 200, but there were too many still. For those in the call that don't know, Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States, has been a colony for more than 100 years now, 126 to be exact, and our government claimed bankruptcy, which resulted in the imposition by the US Congress and the president of a fiscal control board that has demanded the people of Puerto Rico to pay an illegal debt that has promoted severe austerity measures in our country that has led to budget cuts in the education system, and for the first time, allowed to privatize our schools. We have been fighting against the privatization in defense of public education and emancipatory curriculum, and it has been working for more than 25 years. It took them 2 hurricanes in 2017, Hurricane Irma and Maria. One of them was almost Category 5, and those natural disasters as a sense of capitalism to approve finally a law that allowed 10% of our schools to be privatized. Up till this day, 6 years have gone by. They have not been able to privatize 10% of our schools because of the struggles of the community and the Federation, the Teachers Federation's work within the community, organizing parents, students, teachers. And that's very important of a work, not only providing mutual aid to the communities in need after hurricanes, then earthquakes in 2020, then the pandemic, but organizing the community to defend public education. The Teachers Federation has played a huge role on stopping all those schools to be privatized, and we have only at this moment 12 schools that have become charter schools. 2 of them have been shut down. We have been given a huge struggle, and we are waiting for more of them to be shut down with the struggle of the communities. And at the same time, since so many schools have been shut down, I see so many familiar faces here in this call that make me very happy. Dimitri was here, for example, in Puerto Rico for the first time when we were rescuing a school that was shut down by the government. And up till this day, we promote free courses that have been denied to our students. Arts, sports. Sakia has been here with us through the Journey for Justice Alliance. Manuela and so many of you. So Bon have been fighting with us in Puerto Rico, defending the public education system that our kids need. And it has been very important to us. The disaster is not natural. Our disaster is political. And we have been fighting against this political disaster for many decades. And we will continue to fight for public education with our people, organizing our communities.
And can you, you just said something I wonder if you can expand on a little bit. You said our disaster is political. Can you speak a little bit to the importance of political education within FMPR and how that's helping your members, but the community at large defend public education?
Well, our union is a rank and file union, and we have a political education curriculum that we provide to all members. So we learn from each other. Miguel Rivera is right now currently our curriculum education and political education secretary. And we have been organizing teachers, but not only teachers, organizing parents, organizing our students. And together we have been fighting back. Political education is a must because the disaster is political. Our government, the 2 main political parties are parties that promote privatization, that promote school closures, that promote the voucher system, that dismantle public education, and it's up to the people of Puerto Rico to stand up and fight back. In 2019, the power of the people was so huge that we were able to have a governor removed from position, from office, and the entire cabinet. So the people of Puerto Rico are fed up. We have been experiencing privatization, not only in the education system. Right now, as we speak, thousands of Puerto Ricans right now are without the electricity service. The health service has been privatized, and now they are coming for us, and we are fighting back. We are fighting back, organizing and promoting political education through all of our members, and we have been able, thank you to the grants that we have received, to hire community organizers. And we have community organizers throughout the island that are doing the work, school by school, teacher by teacher. The media and online resources are important, but nothing will replace human contact. So we are going to every school, doing assemblies with parents, doing assemblies with our students, doing assemblies with our teachers, providing political education as a holistic way of fighting back and learning from each other. It's not just providing the education, it's receiving what the people know that needs to be done, listening to the people, accomplishing what they need. And the government has been very slick. They have tried to shut down, or they have tried to shut down those schools because they announced 300 school closures at the same time. So from those, we were able to save half, maybe. Our people are fed up. Our people are fighting back. Our people know the importance of public education, and the Teachers Federation is a very respected union because of the work that is not only, it presents union work, it's a work for the community, it's a work with the community that comes from the community, because we are an entire community of educators, parents, students that are fighting back to an emancipatory education that we deserve.
And I want to bring Vaughn's voice into the conversation, but I want to pick up on something Mercedes said, which was there's nothing more important than people being in contact with each other, right? As Mercedes is talking about the hollowing out of public education in Puerto Rico and the closing of schools, right? Like we've seen this in Chicago, in New York, and many other cities here in the States, right? And there's nothing more important than creating an infrastructure and foundation for organizations to come together and learn from each other and sharpen their approaches and their strategies towards not just defending public education, but as Joseph was talking about, actually building a system that is reflective of the kind of multiracial economic democracy that we want to see, right, in this country and around the world moving forward. And so that brings us to Vaughn, kind of brings us full circle to thinking about what strategic alignment looks like across multiple different stakeholders and organizations. So Vaughn, thank you for joining us. I know you're about to impart your wisdom on us. So just introduce yourself and share a snapshot about your organization.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Casey. So I'm Vaughn Martin. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm on the campaign leadership team here at the Center for Popular Democracy. We're one of the largest networks of grassroots community-based organizations in the country. And one of our most critical campaigns is focused on protecting public education and achieving ed justice. So we operate from a theory of change that basically says that if we organize enough directly impacted people, we will have the power we need to transform our communities and ourselves, right? So, and this is transformation to our systems, decision-making structures, narrative, and of course, critical policies. So I'll name like two of our kind of core campaign areas, maybe three, that for a better part of a decade, our education justice program has waged alongside our about a dozen powerful, resilient, Black and Brown led, youth led, parent led, community-based organizations, or you'll hear me call them our affiliates, right? Our affiliates in our network. So it's been grounded in a divest, invest approach, which really drives our core areas. So that one being police-free schools, like many of my comrades here, and the dismantling of the school to prison pipeline through massive divestment from policing and investment in things like restorative justice and mental health counselors, nurses, and overall safe and supportive schools. And we've seen examples of those kinds of fights in places like Salem, Oregon, and Milwaukee, where our affiliates Latinos Unidos Siempre and Leaders Igniting Transformation lit, organized, and won full divestments from police and schools, and are really working hard to protect those victories. And in places like Vegas, where young people at Make the Road, Nevada are also facing down folks like Moms for Liberty who show up to school board meetings and physically threaten our young people as they fight to ban the use of pepper spray, like folks in LA. Our second core strategy is fighting for equitable funding for schools, which includes growing the pie and not just, scrapping for scraps, and advancing progressive revenue campaigns. So really, things like working to change funding formulas. We've seen this in places like Pennsylvania. We have parents in Reading who have won investments in like parent resources and continue to work at the state level to increase K-12 funding. And in places like Montgomery County and Maryland, where CASA has helped to secure investments in public education through the Blueprint for Maryland's Future and changing to a weighted school funding formula. Not the sexiest work, but like super important if we're thinking about growing the pie and actually getting full investment in education. It really allows folks to push for the resources needed in their localities. And all of these cases are ones where our network learn from each other. The last thing I'll say as a snapshot is that as our folks do local and state levels, we do convene our education justice network to do like divestments from federal funding in police and schools through our National Youth Mandate platform, which I can talk a little bit more about. And then also through a growing strategy of about 10 of our affiliates centered on shared governance, making sure that our people are in the seats that hold decision-making power. We know that if we're only waging policy and legislative campaigns, we might be leaving power on the table. So that means developing out a really robust electoral campaign that contends with white nationalist powers on the right and advances a vision for safe, inclusive schools and getting our people in those seats to pass progressive policies across the country. So that's our third kind of campaign area that wraps up our snapshot.
And let me just to expand on something. So you've been doing this for a minute, if I can say that. You've been doing education justice organizing in California before you were doing it on a national level. You mentioned, getting a number of organizations across the country to think through their work through this divest invest framework. How important has it been in terms of like getting people to think of that as a strategic framework collectively for some of the successes that you've seen over the years?
Yeah. Super critical. I mean, our role as a national network is to name national issues as national issues and providing space for us to address them strategically at a national level, right? So we know the right is organized and they're clear about how they plan to dismantle public ed, and we really must take seriously our work to come together as a united front, right? We know that we're stronger together, and that if we really harness the power of our base, we have an ability to really fundamentally reshape our schools and our communities. So we do that in a number of ways. I won't get into the nitty gritty, but like, Mercedes was saying, and that was an amazing segue to talk about the like true value of bringing folks together. If you ask any of our network, what is the like top value add of, CPD, or even I'm sure like AEJ and other folks who bring together nationally, right? They will tell you simply being in space, building relationships with one another, facilitating spaces where they can reflect and troubleshoot, demonstrate solidarity, build campaigns, and yeah, just really tackle some of these major systems. We know that like racial capitalism and white supremacy attempts to make us feel like we are struggling against these systems alone, right, as individuals. So we really prioritize our resources to convene our folks, bring them together, physically in learning spaces, virtually, of course, on Zoom, do political education training, skills building trainings, things around their, how to build a budget, how to analyze a budget, strategic research, narrative building, right? All of these things that we think if, coming together and building that kind of organizational infrastructure, we can learn critical lessons and take those lessons into these like, fights to win education justice across the country.
Collected action. Thank you, Vaughn. And I think, bring people together. So I want to close out this conversation we've had with folks thinking about what Vaughn just shared about the importance of bringing people together, because there's a manifesto / blueprint called Project 2025 that is circulating right now, which is a call to bring people together to change democracy forever in the US. And one of the major points in that call, in that manifesto or blueprint, is about deconstructing or disrupting public education in the US, right? It's about getting rid of the Federal Department of Education. It's about moving more resources to militarize and police schools. And what they're doing right now is they are out searching for people to bring together to make that a reality if the conditions present themselves. And so, it's hard sometimes. I know I go down to sleep and sometimes I'm not really grasping that democracy may be on the brink. And I think it can also be hard to grasp that, public education as a public good, which has been offered here for so long, might also be on the brink. And how do we actually pull it back from that and build something that really works for everyone? And I think that's a little bit of what we heard from folks today, is about how they're doing that every day. And with that, I want to bring in Bethiel Germa Holton from the Oak Foundation and the CJSF Executive Committee.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Casey. Thank you so much to all of our panelists. For all of you joining us today, thank you for being here. We are opening the opportunity for you all to reflect a little bit. So you're going to get a Padlet link in the chat. You'll have 3 minutes to answer the question that calls out to you the most, and I'll read through them quickly. And then we'll have about 5 or 6 minutes to discuss. So our questions are: what questions do you have for our partners about the imperatives or about the imperatives? Can you share an example of when your foundation robustly invested in organizational capacity and in long-term movement infrastructure building? What change did this make possible? How is your foundation thinking about Project 2025? Or if they're not thinking about Project 2025, what questions you have or advice you'd ask for from our panelists? And 4, what concerning trends do you see in philanthropy that impact your ability to invest further in organizing or long-term power building? or in the 5 imperatives? Again, please answer one or as many of these questions, with the ones that really stand out, call out to you. And if you have questions for our panelists, we'll invite them back to respond. So I will call you all back in 3 minutes. We have a question here that I'd love to open it up to some members, some of the panelists, and I can maybe weigh in too, but I'd love to hear from you all first. So there's a question here around the concerning trends in philanthropy. And the question is, our trustees are often fixated on measurable outcomes. How do we measure power building in order to demonstrate progress? Kessie, I wonder if you want to start us off on this question and maybe direct it to anyone else you think might want to weigh in, or if panelists, if anyone wants to raise their hand, but maybe if you want to kick us off.
Yeah, I will. And I would say like there's both a science, I think, to this. And there's a vibes to power building as well. But there's definitely a science, right? And so when organizations are building power, building campaigns, oftentimes there are certain things that they are measuring that may not be a policy win in a year, right? And so you can create benchmarks towards progress towards winning policy campaigns, and you can create benchmarks towards building power. So for example, associative power is definitely a benchmark towards building power. So if I am a youth group who's working and organizing in Los Angeles, and we have a vision for, expanding community schools, for bringing holistic programs into schools, who do we need to build relationships with and maybe bring in the coalition? That might be a teachers union, that might be social worker groups, right? Like you are creating a plan that's taking into account all the different areas of power, which is within your own organization. That could be how many members you have, how effective your political education is in building leaders. Do we have leaders that are going from being members to being able to facilitate meetings, being able to engage, people who work for the district? There are all kind of little ways in which people are measuring building power. I think a lot of organizations in the CJSF ecosystem are approaching their work in identifying how they're building power in a scientific kind of way, even though it may not seem, power may not always seem that scientific, but also others should jump in.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else have thoughts on this question? Now, I'll say for me, coming from Oak Foundation, which our education program has not historically funded organizing or advocacy, and our trustees, when I brought CJSF as a potential grant, there were a lot of questions about outcomes, and I was actually able to redirect the conversation to learning more just about organizing and advocacy first, because I realized we can't even really talk about outcomes when we don't understand how the space operates. And we don't want to be a funder that comes in expecting outcomes without the context of the field and the environment. And so my advice as a fellow funder for some of y'all, in addition, I think what Casey shared is great, and I'd love to hear other thoughts. It's also to think about kind of what does your foundation know about organizing and advocacy, and can you take a learning orientation before you're trying to lock organizations into really specific outcomes. I'll give another minute, see if there are any other panelists with thoughts or ideas here. And if not, I'd love to move to this other question we have here for any of our folks in the field thinking about the strategic imperatives that Dimitri talked through. How do investments in these imperatives support your ability to do the work that you do, to craft a new vision for a public education, to transform communities you're working in? Any thoughts, feedback, reflections on those imperatives?
I'm sorry, can you repeat it one more time?
Yeah, thinking about the strategic imperatives that we started this conversation with, how do investments in those imperatives really impact your work? Do you think, are there any ones that are more important from your perspective than the others?
Yeah, I mean, I'll start. I think, something around the narrative piece of what's happening seems to be something really vitally important. The other side has a loud megaphone, and because they're so loud and they can build off of each other, it feels like it's everywhere. It feels like they're everywhere. And again, I don't want to underestimate the power of feeling hopeless. Like how how do you get up the next day if you feel like you've already lost? And we know our long history of needing to define things in encyclopedia format, where the other side is very simple, right? Bad schools, bad teachers, get rid of the whole thing, right? Which is easy. And I think our narrative, specifically around our wins, our successes, in spite of all these things on a collective national, actually, I would say global stage, is not something that is out there enough. And when we do get that out there, that's why these spaces are so important. But even CJSF, I feel like, does a great job of making sure that we are in community and having these conversations. Because as Mercedes got on this call and said, I'm going through something, right? But being on this call is an inspiration. It's inspiring me. I don't want to we cannot underestimate the power of offering hope to our people, because it allows them to get up, rinse and redo and do the thing over. And also it allows us to be able to say, hey, things might not be looking good here, but you know what they're doing in California? Like Joseph is like killing and lady are killing it as it pertains to young people, and their money is being put behind it. And we too can do this thing. So
thank you so much for sharing that, and particularly connecting to what you were sharing earlier. When some of these wins take 30 years, it's the power of that community to be able to connect with each other and inspire each other, because the work is hard and it is happening over a very long term. You have to stay committed. And so I appreciate those reflections. Lady, I thought I saw a hand earlier. I just want to see in our last minute if you have any comments, any final comments here.
Yeah, I mean, I think the space that we provide for people to come together is one of the first thing that gets cut when there's no money, right? Like in person is so important for relationship building, for trust building. The other side has fear, and that's what connects everybody. And for us to build trust and to go through a process of liberation, we got to meet in person. And those are the first things that get cut when there's budget problems.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for adding to that again. And thank you again to all of the panelists. Thank you for being here, for sharing your experience and your wisdom, your perspective. Again, everyone, I'm Bethiel. I'm a program officer at Oak Foundation. Oak is a global family foundation that focuses on a number of issue areas. I'm in the education program, which focuses on students with learning disabilities like dyslexia and other learning differences like ADHD. Oak is a donor member of CJSF. We're also a member of the Ed Funders group, of this group that's convening us today. And like I said, Oak doesn't have an explicit organizing or advocacy strategy, but we support CJSF because we believe that young people deserve joyful, inclusive, responsive classrooms and schools, and believe that organizers and advocacy are the key to ensuring that happens at a systems level for all kids. And one of the things I appreciate the most about being an executive committee member for CJSF is that I learn about equitable grant making. CJSF models how to be a funder that follows the lead of and listens deeply to movement partners like the folks we heard from today. And I'm really appreciative of that work. As you all know, and I know you've heard, there's a growing perception in philanthropy that we are losing the battle to reimagine public education. Today, you heard about the needs. You heard of some of the needs of the groups at the front lines of this work. You also learned about the wins and actions of organizations that are proving that community-led efforts can shift policy and reimagine schools that are safe and welcoming of all students and nurture their full potential. Again, we heard a lot of wins today. Joseph talked about centering young people and their leadership in the work, and the wins to divest from police and investing in youth-serving programs. Zakia talked about engaging parents and community members to hold legislature accountable. We heard from wins in Puerto Rico to New York to LA, all across the country. We also know that the backlash and backslide is relentless and well-funded, very, very well-funded, and most harmful to the most vulnerable communities. As a CJSF donor member, I get to shepherd my foundation's resources towards this important work and supporting grassroots community-led advocacy and organizing that benefits all students, all young people and communities. I encourage all of you who are listening in today to join CJSF 17 donor members, be a part of this group. and support the work now. It's urgent, it's necessary, and again, the backlash and backslide is well funded. Please reach out to me if you'd like to discuss this at all, particularly if you have not traditionally funded organizing. I'm happy to strategize with you. I was you 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, and now we're very happy CJSF donor members. So again, I'd hope to see you part of this table, part of this group. Please reach out if you'd like to learn more from the foundation perspective of being a member. And again, thank you for being here today. I'll pass it to my colleagues at CJSF.
Thank you, Bethiel. Greetings, everyone. My name is Alexandra Manin Nunez, and I am the Deputy Director of Development at CJSF. We are really grateful to be on this learning journey with funders and to be part of Funders' broader theme of investing in people, relationships, and power. We also want to express gratitude to our grantee partners for their dedication to the work on the ground and their honest and clear guidance to philanthropy, which they shared today. But before we leave, I want to ask you to do 3 things, and I promise that they are low lift. I promise. The first is, if you haven't already, please complete the survey where you can download the report, as well as share feedback about today's session. The second, I've dropped the link in the chat, by the way. The second is to stay connected. Email us if you want to learn about CJSF and our grantee partners. Manuela and I have shared our emails on the slide. Bethiel has graciously offered herself as well. You can also check the appropriate box on the survey link that I shared in the chat. You can also stay connected by joining us at our upcoming events. And so on July 17th, we're co-hosting a pre-institute on artificial intelligence. It'll be in person in Minnesota. We're partnering with Funders for Justice, the Twin City Innovative Alliance, and the Schott Foundation to bring you this special learning session curated specifically for funders. And the session is part of the Data for Public Good Conference. The link to register is also shared in the chat. Lastly, stay connected by joining us and EdFunders' continued briefings on education justice. EdFunders will share more information about both sessions really soon. And I promised you it was 3 things, so here's the last one. Please remain steadfast and remember that our counterparts on the front lines are stronger with our support. So again, thank you. We're really grateful for your presence and your contributions, and I will hand it over to Stephanie.
Thank you all so much again for joining us. This was a really powerful conversation. We hope that you will stay connected for continued conversations in this series about education justice. I'm really stuck with Vaughn's words about growing the pie so folks aren't scrapping for scraps. So that's going to be one of my takeaways. And we know that folks are coming away with lots of different takeaways about what it's going to take to really sustain this work, because that's what this moment needs. It's what all of our young people deserve. So by way of some final announcements before we close out, just wanted to remind everyone that the video from today's recording will be available in about a week, and you can sign up via the QR code there for updates from EdFunders. We also have some information about some upcoming programs. As Alex mentioned, we're going to continue the conversation about education justice in September and November. There's some information on this slide about some of our upcoming virtual programs, as well as an opportunity to engage in a conversation about education justice in person with us in Montgomery, Alabama next month. We would love to have you all join us for our study tour of the legacy sites. And finally, our annual conference registration will be open July 2nd. So we're really looking forward to gathering with folks in person in Minneapolis this October, and we hope that you will join us. Thank you all so much again for being on with us this afternoon. Thank you to CJSF and all of the movement partners who spoke today. We really appreciate your time, and keep fighting. Thank you.